Well, good morning, everyone. Stretch out a little bit. Welcome to Morning Coffee. I'm Sheldon Neil. I got my cup right here. I hope you got yours too. Halloween, just around the corner. Today, we're talking about Halloween and horror films. Is there a link? Someone who's going to help us understand that just a little bit better is Peter Chattaway, film critic, helping us understand more. Peter, let's start right here. Since horror movies, for some, tend to give, the devil a lot of airtime. We tend to think that Christians would flee from this genre, but that isn't the case, is it? Tell us about Scott Derrickson and his films.
His first film for the big screen as a director was The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which was loosely based on a true story about a woman who had gone through an exorcism and had died, and the people who were presiding over the exorcism were sent to court. They were tried in court for they were held responsible for her death, so it's a fictionalized version of that story, and it's a movie that explores the question of whether demons are real or not, and what our responses to them should be, and what our responsibility should be if our responses go bad, if they end up with a bad result. And that mixing of genres has allowed him to do some interesting stuff with the horror elements as well. And plus, he is a Christian himself, and so his films have had a definite theological sensibility that you don't always find in the genre.
It's very interesting. Scott Derrickson claims that horror movies are the ideal forum for presenting the Christian gospel. I'm wondering, good and evil are on full display and bold spiritual questions are being tackled. So do you think a well-made horror film could lead people to Christ?
Some would argue that they have, and some would argue, the Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson movie, was allegedly responsible for a number of conversions, and many people would regard The Passion of the Christ as a horror movie because it had a very strong presentation of evil, all the horrific things that are done to Jesus in the film, but not just the physical pain he suffers, but there are scenes in that film where Jesus is staring down Satan. Nobody else can see Satan in that film except for Jesus and I think his mother as well. And there are these demonic kids who taunt Judas at one point. And there's a lot of really horrifying imagery in The Passion of the Christ. And call it spiritual warfare or what you will, but that film has had a profound impact on the spirituality of some of the people who saw it.
Can you give examples of horror films that have provoked viewers to ask themselves what they honestly think about the supernatural, about God, and maybe even life after death?
One of the biggest box office hits of all time, certainly when you adjust for inflation, was The Exorcist, which came out about 42 years ago now. And The Exorcist was it was a very shocking film. And The Exorcist was written by a man who was William Peter Blatty, who is very definitely profoundly concerned with questions of good and evil and the spiritual realities beyond this world, whatever he thinks about them. But he's certainly probing those issues very sincerely. And I think the film reflected that vision or respected that vision of his. And in a lot of horror films, they sort of take this roundabout way of affirming the notion of transcendent meaning, of affirming a belief in God by saying, okay, you say you don't believe anything, well, guess what? The devil exists, and because the devil exists, there must be a God as well.
Should Christians be wary of watching horror films?
I think Christians should be wary of watching any films. I don't think there's any such thing as a safe film, really. I think films always have an effect on our imagination somehow. C.S. Lewis wrote in the Screwtape Letters that there are two errors we can fall into with regard to the demonic world. One is to not believe in it. The other is to believe in it and become too obsessed with it. And certainly there are people, and I think that obsession plays out in a number of ways. Certainly Christians can become too obsessed with horror films. I think Christians can become too obsessed with the demonic, whether or not films are involved. It is possible. But I think at the same time, movies exist partly to, I think Roger Ebert once said that movies are empathy machines. They are ways of learning to think outside ourselves and learning to feel what other people feel and see how other people see things. And one of the things people experience is fear. And horror movies allow us to identify with the fears of other people. They also allow us to test our own fears.
Well, thank you, Peter, for chatting with us. Appreciate the time, my friend. Well, that's all the time I've got. You enjoy your morning coffee.